Shabby, welcome.
Good to be with you guys.
When we met you, you were a mere plaintiff. Now you're a host of a show.
Yes, I'm what's called a PragerU personality, so I've really moved on up.
How many red pills have they given you upon your first day?
No comment.
Not the whole thing. You'll go full woke right, but
you wake up in a matrix chair at PragerU.
And Dennis is there. Everyone's there like,
welcome.
Yeah, he's completely bald, no hair. Oh my gosh, they put him in a suit for the first time. Okay, let's get down. Let's talk talkless, right down to business. In this episode, Shabbos, we are discussing all things Mamdani. Before we get to the meat of it, though, you've been making a lot of rounds on the press circuit. How has that been in general? Just catch us up. Since last time, as Michael mentioned, you are notable as the guy who sued Harvard, but now you're making a name for yourself out there, offering commentary and insight on all sorts of issues, especially the Israel stuff. And yeah, I've been seeing you on Piers a bunch of times in a bunch of these, I wouldn't call them necessarily hostile environments, but places where you have to really, make your case quickly and concisely. So how's that been going?
Yeah, it's definitely a new environment because a show like Piers Morgan or Al Arabiya, which is a Saudi Arabian equivalent of Al Jazeera, they're looking for the 30-second soundbite. And if you don't have that 30-second soundbite, they will either cut you off or they will challenge your point immediately. Obviously, there's a bias within the mainstream media against pro-Israel voices, pro-Jewish voices, but that's just how the game is played. I'm not necessarily complaining. All it means is that when you go on these shows, you have to know that you are perceived as the enemy, right? You are perceived as someone that they're trying to trip up. They're looking for the gotcha moment. And as I said, I think we're sort of lucky because we have facts and logic and reality on our side, which sort of helps us and makes the case for us. But yeah, Piers Morgan is a great example of this, whereby I was on a show last week, and right before they had me on, along with Colonel Richard Kemp, they had, I'm forgetting his name, but he's a pro-Palestinian activist. He wants to build a hospital in Gaza, which are very noble causes, obviously. And it was about a 30-minute interview he had with him. No interruptions, no gotcha moments, no challenging questions. And then he has me and Colonel Kemp on. And within the first 30 seconds, it's, how do you defend the genocide? How do you say what's happening is not terrible? So you see there's like this obvious double standard. But as I said, that's how the game is played. And so long as you believe in the cause and you can be a relatively effective spokesman, then I'm fine with that media landscape.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike. I was just going to say it's important not to confuse which format you're on. Are you on a long form podcast where you want to extrapolate nuanced ideas, or are you engaged in mortal combat? And Piers Morgan is verbal combat, and I think it's important mainly because I don't judge people who don't want to go on and aren't comfortable in that kind of arena, and I don't judge people who do. There's millions of people watching. That's the truth of it, and he covers these things and brings a lot of people to it. So that's who you're really trying to reach. But there is a certain style and approach one has to take that strategically, if you insult Piers or personally attack him or any one of the guests, it will go south very, very quickly. So you are being put in some sort of spotlight to make a case, and just kind of understanding what arena you're fighting in will allow, I think, the different people who go on to use the proper tool set, because sometimes people bring the wrong tool set to these things, and like you said, they get tripped up really quickly. And I've seen people do well, and I've seen people fail. So
yeah, and if I could just add quickly, I know after his treatment of Natasha Hosdorf, who's of course the pro-Israel British lawyer, she's an activist, she's in a fantastic legal mind, and he was really ganging up on her. He was quite chauvinistic. Then there was sort of in the pro-Israel space, there was this discussion of we need to boycott Piers Morgan, and even accusations that he's an anti-Semite. I don't think he's an anti-Semite. I just don't. I don't see evidence for it. Do I think he has this double standard? Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. But to your point, it is a major platform. You are reaching an audience that traditional news outlets just do not reach. And if we can be effective on that platform, then why wouldn't we do it? And we were sort of joking about this before we went on for the recording, but it's kind of true. If they don't have someone like Jonathan Conricus or Elon Levy or even Shai Davidai, they're going to have Shmuley Boteach. All right, they're going to have bad spokesmen for the cause. They're going to have people who do not portray our narrative in a positive light. So better we go on that platform and try to portray our story in a positive light than these other, nefarious actors. So I'm happy to keep going on the show.
You're about to appear on Shmuley's Instagram. Here come the screenshots. Ironically, I think Piers is the only man on earth Shmuley has not called an anti-Semite, which is weird. You're an anti-Semite. He goes up to kindergartens in Muslim neighborhoods. Anti-Semite. He just kicked me. That pool's an anti-Semite. I stripped in that pool. I stubbed my toe. That corner's an anti-Semite. But we're having too much fun with that. I hear you. And I also think like jumping to conclusions to call someone, to use the. I want to jump into the next thing. Michael, did you have any comment on this before we jump into?
I just had one question, just very quickly. Can you tell us about the art of like how you hold yourself while you're listening to other people say messed up stuff, like the faces you have to make while you're listening and it's not your turn to speak?
You know, it's funny you say that, because the first time, the first time I went on Piers was actually the first day I started working at PragerU. In particular, it was the first 5 minutes of walking into the PragerU building, and they said, "We need you on right now." So I wasn't prepared. I wasn't, I didn't even know what the main topic was going to be. And I just decided right then and there, I'm not sure if it's an effective strategy, but just have a stoic face. Don't react. Don't get too emotional or too combative. So I was debating with Anna Kasparian, it's interesting. She works for the Young Turks, but she says, I'm an Armenian. I know what a genocide is, but yet she works for the Young Turks, which were primarily responsible for the Armenian genocide, but I digress. And as a recovering socialist, I grew up literally 13, 14, 15 years old, watching Anna Kasparian, watching Cenk Uygur, watching the Young Turks, and they were really informative to my worldview. So I was debating her, and it became clear that something within her psyche kind of just snapped. This was not a rational debate. So as I said, I just took this approach of don't really react, have the same face. And about a few hours after the debate, I saw on the Groyper neo-Nazi side of Twitter, which I frequent often, they kind of took a screenshot of that debate with a picture of my face saying, this is the Jews' reaction when Anna calls out the victim Holocaust card. And it was just funny because that was just my expression the entire debate. So I don't really know what they were picking me on for. So I take the approach of don't get too emotional, try to be the reasoned, respectable figure. Because I think overall, while it may not work for Twitter, a public audience, like the electorate, they like people, I would imagine, who are just more level-headed and don't yell and scream. So that's the approach I'm taking. But it's very hard because you are being berated.
Which is exactly what Cenk Uygur does. Always level-headed, never loses his cool. You will not speak over me. But what's funny is also you have to remember sometimes there's a delay in the feed. So if you roll your eyes and it's ill-timed, you just look way on the spectrum. You don't want to do that because it's just like all of a sudden. And it happens like at the wrong time. So if you have to maintain the stoic face, if only for the timing, because I know sometimes there's like a delay. And if you roll your eyes 5 seconds after someone said something, they're like, what did that guy just do? He twitched.
And again, Cenk and Anna, it works really well for Twitter, especially being anti-Israel. You will get 3-4 million views in a 30-second clip. But as I said, when it comes to like the national electorate, I just don't know if they're making effective arguments because people just look at Cenk and it's a very easy caricature. So I'm not too persuaded by their approach.
Yeah. So I think it's a perfect transition into how to engage in this properly. I think jumping to conclusions to call people you object to anti-Semites, moving on to the engaging in this public discourse effectively to what I think is real anti-Semitism. We are doing this episode as a real deep dive into Mamdani and what's happened in New York City as him becoming the winner of the primary and poised to be the next mayor of New York City. I think it's an interesting time where I think you're right about Pierce and people jumping to conclusions because they objected to how he treated Natasha, which I think was fair. And I think actually it looked worse for him and Dave Smith in that episode. Yeah. Why bring two people to an arena to compete and be the referee and not let one team compete at all? It doesn't make the other side look good. It does no favors. I think Dave even knew that, even though he wouldn't admit it. Besides that, jumping to call him an anti-Semite, I don't think is productive or true. I think it does a disservice. But to the real issues at hand, when we really do see anti-Semitism, there's also this sort of territory we're in now where, you see someone like Mamdani. He, in a way, it's refreshing that a lot of the caricatures, people will call him a socialist, a communist, these extreme views, like he owns a lot of that. But what he doesn't do explicitly is say, walk around the streets as someone of the left, of the socialists, and say, I hate Jews. At the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean, I don't think he's not anti-Semitic or is animated by these anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist ideas, but it behooves us to be very precise, and discerning in how we do this and call out what we think are problematic. So in your mind, what are some of the things about Mamdani that just jump out to you as, for me, he's the human embodiment of the college encampment, the socialism, the radical Islamism, the anti-Zionism. But in your estimation, when you're criticizing him, how do you do it in a way that's constructive, that doesn't just go on deaf ears and turn people off? Oh, he's just calling another guy an anti-Semite.
Yeah, I'll use a dirty word, which is context. Let's back up for a second. On the night of the election, or the Democratic primary at least, I was actually pretty confident that Andrew Cuomo would win. I didn't think that Mamdani had a large enough coalition. Obviously, I was dead wrong on that. within an hour or two of the polls closing, I was added to about a dozen different Stop Mamdani, Save New York City WhatsApp groups of, relatively influential people. I'm not influential, but I was added to these WhatsApp groups of Wall Street executives, of young activists, of Instagram influencers. And very quickly, I wrote in all of these groups before I had to leave a lot of them because there were a lot of notifications. I said, don't make this about anti-Semitism, because clearly that was not enough of a reason for people to not vote for Mamdani. This race in November cannot and should not be about anti-Semitism. It should not even be about Israel. And the fact that Mamdani says he's going to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu if he comes to New York, which A, he has no jurisdiction over, and B, he would never do. It needs to be about the fact that his policies are so wildly destructive for New York City. And what's great about socialism is it has a 100-year history of failure. So you don't have to take my word for it as a right-wing, conservative, PragerU, MAGA fascist. Just look at Mamdani's own campaign website. He talks, for example, about the need to freeze all of the rents. That would kill any incentive property owners, land developers have to A, building new property, or B, developing the property or maintaining the ones that they currently have. He talks about the need to run city-owned grocery stores. They did this in Baldwin, Florida in 2019. Less than 5 years later, it shut down. The core component of market capitalism is incentives. You have to incentivize people to do things. And when Mamdani goes on CBS, for example, and he says, there shouldn't be any billionaires in this city, which, leaving aside the unethical aspect of taking away people's wealth, the entire premise of Mamdani's economic policy rests on there being billionaires in the city so he can afford all of these expansionist programs. What the top 1% of earners in New York City, they generate 48% of all revenue in New York City. 48% of all the revenue in New York City comes from 1% of the earners. So there comes a certain point where if you tax them out of existence, you won't have the money to pay for these things. He talks about the need to have a $30 minimum wage. I have a relative in New York City who has a small business. He has told me to my face, if I have to pay my workers $30 an hour, I will not be able to operate in New York City. And what about the bodegas? What about the businesses that really do rely on very, very thin profit margins? So we don't have to make this about anti-Semitism because his policies would be so disastrous, because socialism, as Mayor Eric Adams says, has no place in New York City. This is the epicenter of capitalism, and it's the epicenter of incentives, of profits. And I don't think that's a bad thing.
Man, you are at he is at PragerU. Would you look at that? 2 weeks into the game. My goodness gracious. I'm salivating at the mouth here.
Let me add something to that too. Also, the way the argument from Mamdani's side is framed is that real estate owners, are these billionaires who are trying to take advantage of these like poor tenants. No one ever thinks about the small real estate owners. Like most real estate owners, I don't want to say most because I'm not entirely sure, but there's a lot of people who own one building, one apartment in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, and Queens. And like, they're the ones who really get hurt by these rent freezes. They're the ones who can't wait 4 or 5 years for the laws to change. And they're the ones, like these small business owners, who are really going to get hurt, not so much the billionaires.
Correct. And that figure is accurate. It's roughly 2/3 of landowners or real estate developers, I should say. They don't have real estate properties throughout the city. They're not real estate moguls. They have roughly 1, 2, maybe 3 properties. Yes. And the second point we need to be clear on when it comes to freezing the rent, there already exists a sort of analogous program in New York City called NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, which are epicenters of crime, of murders, of rapes, of assaults. I mean, the current New York City Section 8 housing is a disaster. So rather than saying we're going to focus on rebuilding, reforming, we're going to incentivize Section 8 to sort of, redo their buildings, we're just going to do away with the system entirely and just try again. It's a ludicrous idea. And again, I'm sort of at an advantage because I was a socialist for most of my life, and I'm not that old, I'm 25, but I was a socialist up until a year and a half ago. I understand the language that Mamdani speaks in. And more than that, I understand why young people get that language and like that language. Because if you're living in New York City, which is unaffordable, Mamdani is right to focus his campaign exclusively on finances, on the economy, on affordability, and you can't afford things, and someone says, we're going to freeze your rents, we're not going to charge you for groceries, we're going to have free public transportation. I mean, that is exclusively why I voted for Bernie Sanders twice, because this was a 78-year-old man who said, I care about you, and I'm going to cause a political revolution whereby you won't pay for college, you won't pay for your health care, we're going to nation build here and home instead of in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that was an appealing process. As a socialist, it's nice to have people pay for your things, but as the saying goes, eventually you run out of other people's money. So
that's Milton Friedman, baby. We are cooking. You know, it's funny. So you are basically responsible for the rise of Mamdani, you and your ilk, who bought into all these horrible ideas. But it's interesting because I want to park all of that, what you said, for a second strategically, because it's actually quite surprising that you, of all people, who saw like the excesses of anti-Zionism turn into anti-Semitism, translated into actionable harassment against Jews on campus and in New York, like seeing it across different campuses, and New York being one of the epicenters of that, to say we're going to put all of that aside and not like use the Mamdani platform as a classic example of how the Jewish community won't be protected, especially the pro-Israel one, which is a lot of them, will not be protected under an administration like him, which, I mean, I totally understand practically and strategically. You're like, look, people voted for him anyway. It's not enough. But I guess my question is there still something worth holding on to there in pointing out that if, the Israeli Day Parade happens in New York City, is he going to double up the security? Is he going to protect Zionist demonstrators when they get attacked? Is he going to consider that a hate crime, given his feelings and open sentiments about Israel and not believing in Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state and those who support it? I mean, do we just let all that go, or is that a compromise that is like too much to ask for?
I think it's yes and no. American politics is the art of the possible. You have to be pragmatic. So it was not enough of a reason to put forth Andrew Cuomo as the nominee to exclusively talk about anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. I wish it was, but it isn't. But as I said, one of the positive things about Zohran Mamdani is he is essentially a smorgasbord of bad ideas that it becomes quite easy to convince a diverse coalition of New Yorkers why he would not work for diverse reasons. So you can go to the bodega worker and tell him that, sitting in grocery stores would kill his business. You can go to real estate owners, property developers, and tell him why rent freeze would kill his businesses. You can go to the Jewish community and tell them everything you just said about the Israel Day Parade and the college campuses and the protections at synagogues. I think what we need to do, and again, I made this very clear in all these different WhatsApp groups where so many people from many different sectors of the city were coming together scrambling to figure out how to stop him. I said, we need to develop a message that works for particular communities. So yeah, for the Jewish community, we should absolutely focus on the anti-Semitism. I would agree with you. I think that's an issue that we need to reinforce, especially because Andrew Cuomo, who really ran one of the most uninspired campaigns, arguably, in New York City mayoral history, at least in modern New York City mayoral history.
Mad Money doesn't know what he's doing. Vote for me. I need to repair my legacy.
Exactly. I mean, let's really get into the brass tacks here. Borough Park in Williamsburg, ultra-Orthodox enclaves of Hasidic Jews, they remember Andrew Cuomo as the guy who killed all their grandparents during COVID. Because if you remember, Andrew Cuomo told the nursing homes that you have to accept COVID-positive patients. And even when the nursing home said this will be a death sentence to our residents because there's no way we can safely protect the other residents, he said too damn bad. Or you can go to the Me Too activists. You can go to the females on college campuses and say this is a guy who was credibly accused of sexual assault, so they didn't want to vote for him. There was a lot of reasons not to vote for Andrew Cuomo.
I smell hair and I chop a feel. I'm Italian. This is what we do. I did it with my auntie growing up. I would squeeze her butt and give her a hug. This is what we do. Yes. Exactly.
Which turns out is not a very effective or persuasive defense. Yeah. Which, by the way, Zohran Mamdani, I mean, if you want to talk about the Italian-American community, he flips off the Christopher Columbus statue in New York City barely 2 years after he became a citizen. So we could have a whole separate discussion on settler colonialism and the backwards mentality of Zohran Mamdani pertaining to, third worldism and American exceptionalism. Even his July 4th tweet, the first sentence was about, happy July 4th, but also America's a really terrible country that remains unfinished.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you keep it, go ahead, Michael.
Oh, well, just piggybacking off the Cuomo thing. I mean, what do you think now of the Jewish community now, kind of getting behind a candidate, either Cuomo or Eric Adams, who's like pretty crooked, like not the most popular candidate either, just because he's not anti-Semitic? Like, is that a good look for the community?
Well, look, that's what they tried doing with Andrew Cuomo. Whether it's a good look or not, A, it didn't work, but B, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but there were conversations that I was involved with many of the New York Jewish leadership. And we made this case that Cuomo was a very uninspiring candidate. When we would have meetings with him, he would be looking down on his phone. And when we would ask him his our questions, he would sort of look at us disinterested, give us quick answers, and then sort of move on. But we were told to essentially shut up, and he's the only viable candidate. And I got to tell you, I did an event with Mayor Eric Adams. I think it was shortly before the primary elections, and I said, this is a guy. I'm not saying who I'm voting for. I'm not saying who I'm endorsing, but this is a guy who, let's call a spade a spade. He showed up for our community. He is actually going to introduce, I don't know if this is off the record or not, but in the coming days, he's going to introduce a mask ban in New York City. He actually has produced a lot of good results for the Jewish community. And I honestly think, even though hindsight is 2020, of course, had the Jewish community rallied around Eric Adams and said, Andrew Cuomo was someone who gaslit us. Remember the red zones, or whatever he called it during COVID, where he said there's certain communities that aren't listening to the guidelines and they were exclusively Orthodox communities, which he arbitrarily just made up and then he had to apologize for. But Eric Adams did show up for us. And at this event, I told the Jewish leadership in front of Eric Adams, in Judaism, we have a concept called Takara Satov, showing gratitude and appreciation. And I'm pretty grateful for his leadership.
You don't stand for me, I stand for you. And you should never be afraid to wear your yarmulke in the subway. I do remember that. Certainly as far as the personal connection and the advocacy on our behalf, sure. But one can understand. Yeah, I guess that's a good answer in the politics, especially at the local level, where, there's obviously principles that we have and try to abide by and stay consistent with. And then there's the people who are going to advocate for the interests that you have for your community, whether and the priorities like safety, security. And then, I just on the Mamdani thing, if you focus purely on the economic side of it, then you have to get into the weeds of arguing against those low-hanging fruit socialist arguments that repeat themselves and appeal to younger generations who just see grievance. They see a lot of prosperity and wealth and assume that is simply the given. And when they see things lacking, there must be someone to blame. And to tap into that is it's very tricky emotionally and psychologically to argue against that, because who doesn't love free stuff? Who doesn't love revolution, prosperity, making things better? And it's just on the emotional resonance. Capitalism always struggles to do that. But I just wonder what actually galvanizes people. I think in the Jewish community side of things, you're right. I think us feeling vulnerable as a community is one way, but to the other people, you've been in that mindset where you're like, these ideas sound inspiring to me. So talk a little bit more about that. Like when you're getting into the heads of these young people, let's be gracious and say, if Mamdani was a hardcore capitalist and felt the way he did about Israel, I'd still be very concerned, but I'd be like, hey, at least his policies are going to do well for the city, and he's not an international figure, so all's well and good. He'll be a great capitalist mayor. What do you see can be the most harmful from him holding socialist positions in terms of what authority he has, and how do you appeal to those as someone with a former socialist broken brain?
Socialist broken brain. On an objective level, the problems that Mamdani is diagnosing are fairly accurate. The city is unaffordable. The crime rates in the city are way too high. So he's diagnosing the right things, and he's speaking the right language of, we are going to take care of it by starting and embarking upon a political revolution where the status quo, the political culture of our city is unsustainable, and therefore we are going to get rid of the process entirely. That was Bernie Sanders' argument in 2016 and in 2020. That's why I voted for him. It's why I supported him. It's why I was a Bernie bro in the 2016 Democratic Convention, because he made a very clear argument that we cannot afford things at home. Meanwhile, we're paying for things in Iraq and Afghanistan and across the world, and young people need a political revolution, which is why I said both publicly on my Twitter and reaching out to the Eric Adams campaign, if you want to win, you need to create a plan. What are you going to do to bring costs down? What are you going to do to create more accessibility for housing? To simply say, well, I'm not the socialist, that doesn't work anymore. Because whereas for older generations, socialism was a pejorative, it was an insult to be called a socialist, Zohran Mamdani takes that label with pride. You want to call him a Muslim socialist? He'll say, damn right I am. And as we've seen based on the primary results, it's an effective argument. He owns his positions. Eric Adams, it's unclear what his positions actually are. Again, I would still sympathize with Adams more than Mamdani, simply because Adams would describe himself as a capitalist, and Mamdani obviously doesn't. But still, Adams will have a very difficult road ahead if he can't articulate the things he will do differently. And that's another issue we have to deal with. He's the incumbent. So when he talks about, yeah, there are problems, well, the obvious question is, well, why didn't you do anything about it? And then again, from another pragmatic standpoint, Curtis Sliwa and Andrew Cuomo are not going to drop out. So Andrew Cuomo came out yesterday, actually, a spokesman came out saying, we're going to conduct a poll in September. And in September, whatever the poll's finding is, who is the most effective anti-Mamdani candidate, will abide by that poll, which number one, they're not going to abide by it. And number two, by September, it's way too late. So as long as you have 3 different people running against Mamdani wins. It's really that simple.
I completely agree. Sorry, there's a little delay there, Michael. I completely agree that the alternative to socialism, it has to be positive. It has to be also revolutionary and have the same emotional impact. If you look at 2012 Romney versus 2016 Trump, 2012 Romney said, I don't want to talk about my business record. I had a good career. I don't want to talk about it. I'm embarrassed to be this rich guy. And Trump said, I'm really rich. I'm really rich. I got a lot of money, billions of dollars. And say what you want. Think he's the devil or the angel for that, or the hero or the villain. You respect it because he is proud of what he is and believes in it. And that confidence, I think too often the counter to socialism is simply how bad and destructive it is. And then when they want to make a capitalist argument, they try to also have a little bit of socialism in there to appeal to those same people, rather than standing on your own principles and your own sense of assurance that my system works, my beliefs, my ideology is better and more virtuous. And I don't know, I hope that maybe an Adams or an alternative can have that, but we've yet to see that proud kind of thing. You end up getting a little bit of a socialism light. Mamdani has a point, but work with me. I'm a little more sensible. And people are like, I don't want sensible. I want to shake things up here because it sucks. Michael? Yeah.
Oh no, I want to just remind Shabbos of your second question, which is what powers does a mayor have that could practically make a Jew feel afraid in the city if he wins mayor? I know that emotionally it's scary, but tachlis,
Right.
what is it that a Jew might have concern over if a mayor was anti-Semitic?
Well, I think they're practical concerns. So nonprofit security grants, for example, in many cases don't just come from the federal government, they also come from the city government. So if you have a candidate like Zohran Mamdani who says, all these synagogues that have Israeli real estate sales, they don't need city protection because that goes against international law, which it doesn't. But why should I support that? Why should the city support that? When it comes to, as you said, the Israel Day Parade, why should we devote thousands of New York City police officers and resources to a parade that promotes genocide and settler colonialism and apartheid? What happens, and we've already seen this in New York City, where 2/3 of all religiously based hate crimes are targeted against Jews, in particular Orthodox Jews, with a candidate who made a Hanukkah video, spoofing and making fun of Jews. So that's not someone who really, A, understands our community, and B, has shown any practical desire to help that community. And we got to be honest that, as I said, politics is not only the art of the possible, but American politics are exclusively transactional. It's a very cynical way of looking at American politics, but it's also a realistic way of looking at American politics. All presidential campaigns, all the way down to mayoral campaigns, they make concessions to constituencies and they make concessions to communities in the same way that Zohran Mamdani made concessions to the LGBTQ plus community, to the African American community. He needs to make concessions to the Jewish community.
His own community, the African American community. But yes,
right, right. His brothers on the Black community.
He wrote that on the college app. I'm African American, but keep going.
And by the way, maybe I shouldn't say this. When I applied to Harvard, I wrote that I was gay, which I'm not. Why did I write I was gay? Because I knew that in the DEI world, it'll help. So why the hell not? But at least I'm honest enough whereby I know that it's a game and I know it's a bunch of BS. And I wish, if I was in control, that we could do something about it and we could get rid of that system. Zohran Mamdani pretends that there's virtues in DEI and there are virtues in affirmative action, while at the same time, subconsciously or internally, he knows it's a bunch of bullshit, but he'll try to game the system anyway.
The Harvard admissions board really screwed up when they let you in. That was a huge mistake on their part.
They're like, you know what? We're looking at your application, Shabbos. You're going to have to prove it. Prove it. Bring him in. Fernando. Like you to meet Shabbos. Wow.
Let me just
Prove
say,
it.
I always joke that I don't know if Harvard was anti-Semitic pre-October 7th. They're definitely anti-Semitic after October 7th because they're thinking like, we let this Jew in. They gave me a full scholarship, and he thanks us by suing us. So I can't imagine they like us too much.
Well, you know what? If they're not anti-Semitic, they're definitely homophobic after what they did to you, Shabbos. All right. Well, this is a segment as part of the episode that wraps it up for today. Thank you for your insight and congrats on the shows coming up. We look forward to seeing a lot more of you. Shabbos Kesternbaum of Prager University. Keep at it, man. You're doing great work. Any announcements? Because we're looking for alternative mayors here, Shabby. And I know you just got to LA, but if we want to make a news on this show on Ami's House, now's the opportunity. What do you say?
PragerU is a nonprofit, and I will leave my personal political decisions for another time. But thank you very much for having me.
Fair enough. Thank you for joining us on Uncensored. Ami's House. We appreciate having Shabbos Kesternbaum. Back to the show, ladies and gentlemen.